Story 1. Strangeness in the Borderlands. For close to a century, the officers of the United States Border Patrol have traversed the foothills and valleys of the Otay Mesa, located in California's San Diego County. But in addition to contending with an endless stream of individuals attempting to illegally enter the United States, these agents have sometimes encountered intruders of a far more inexplicable nature. The agent watched on through his imaging scope as the other 3 members of his team quickly made their way across the valley floor below. As they readied themselves to execute their hastily planned ambush, he continued to provide regular updates in relation to the progress of their quarry. Further along the trail, a group of people had illegally crossed the Mexican border and were steadily progressing deeper into US territory. The scope itself was ex-military and had previously been incorporated into a tank turret. Now, it was unceremoniously wedged into the rear of a pickup, gifted to the Border Patrol, as it was no longer needed by the army. Whilst lacking definition, it was still reliable enough to make out the thermal signature of anything larger than an average-sized dog, and its current readout suggested that the group under observation contained around 30 individuals. When the last of his fellow agents radioed up that they were in position, the trap was finally set. All that was left now was to wait for the perfect time to engage the approaching targets. Border Patrol agents were always outnumbered, so speed and surprise were vital. Only the handlers of these migrants were ever likely to offer resistance. Identifying and apprehending those individuals first was key to success. Several minutes passed before the men down in the valley requested an update. Peering through the scope, the agent replied that they must have been spotted, as the group had now come to a halt. His message was met with an indignant reply. There was no way that the ambush could have been detected. Something else must have caused them to stop. After a few more minutes, the team accepted that any initiative had now been lost and emerged from their hiding places. As they made their way down the White Cross Trail, they suddenly heard crying and wailing up ahead. Unholstering their sidearms, they broke into a run before fanning out to surround their detainees. What the border agents found waiting for them was unlike any group they had previously encountered. Not one of the 35 migrants offered any resistance or attempted to escape. They instead sank to their knees, bursting into tears or praying for mercy and forgiveness. Utterly bemused, their 3 captors lowered their weapons, trying to find out what had transpired. Talking to the few terrified illegals who could speak English, an account was obtained. The members of the group claimed that they had been silently making their way along the trail when they had been detained by a lone Border Patrol agent. This man had spoken to them slowly and deliberately, introducing himself by name and advising them to go no further. He had then vanished, right in front of their eyes. After the agents asked the identity of this individual, their initial confusion gave way to anger. It took several minutes of further interrogation to convince them that the migrants were not lying or deliberately goading them. As they escorted the prisoners to the processing center, each of the agents was consumed by their own thoughts and misgivings. The name that the Mexicans had provided for the man was indeed that of a local Border Patrol agent. Only, He had been killed 4 months previously. On the morning of the 27th of March 1995, Rocky Elmore had awoken in severe discomfort. When he had gone to bed the previous evening, he had already felt unwell, but now he was struggling to focus on anything and could barely think straight due to the pain in his head. Reluctantly accepting that he was not fit for duty, he picked up his phone and called the Brownfield Border Patrol station to call in sick. Rocky was particularly disappointed, as he had been scheduled to work with a new partner for his night shift that evening, agent trainee Luis Santiago. Originally from Puerto Rico, Santiago was easygoing and had a reputation as something of a joker. Elmore had been looking forward to getting to know the new starter a little better, but instead now resigned himself to resting up in order to recover. That evening, he was awoken from a fitful sleep by an unexpected noise coming from the corner of his bedroom. Wearily rising to his feet, he noted that the digital clock on his bedstand indicated that it was 2 minutes past midnight. As he slowly padded across the room to his closet, where his uniform and belt kit were stored, he was intrigued to discover that his radio was emitting a persistent beeping sound. Despite several efforts to stop the noise, Elmore was unsuccessful, eventually removing the battery. He'd not long drifted back to sleep when the phone rang. The voice on the other end of the line was panicked. There had been an incident at the Otay Lakes Dam when the team had tried to detain a group climbing the trail there. A lone agent had transmitted a brief radio message and set off in pursuit, only to later be found dead at the bottom of the cliffs, having sustained fatal head injuries. The deceased man was Luis Santiago. By the time of Santiago's memorial service the following Friday, Rocky had sufficiently recovered from his illness to attend. When he returned home, he went back to bed, but was again awoken by his radio beeping in the closet. As he wearily removed the battery for a second time, Elmore again glanced at his clock and was unnerved to discover that it was once more displaying the time of 2 minutes past midnight. On his return to duty, Elmore attempted to requisition a new radio, only for the request to be denied. He was told that there was nothing inside the device capable of making such a sound, and that he must have been imagining things. It was only later that day that Rocky discovered further details about the death of his fellow agent, and was unnerved to read that the time of Santiago's last radio transmission on the night he died had been 2 minutes past midnight. Several months later, on the evening of July the 6th, Rocky found himself working a desk shift at the Brownfield Processing Centre. Much like his fellow agents, he enjoyed the occasional spell inside the detention block, as the high number of migrants who required booking in meant that the shifts always passed quickly. Sure enough, not long after he came on duty, a sizable group of detainees was escorted into the building. As he began to work through the prisoners, Elmore noticed that they appeared more subdued than normal. Often, illegal immigrants were quite chatty and friendly when they were detained, holding the American agents in higher regard than the criminals who had taken their money to escort them across the border. But these migrants eyed their captors with suspicion, with several refusing to make eye contact. With the party booked in, Rocky settled into a quick coffee break with the team who had captured them, and listened with interest to the circumstances behind the arrests. The men and women had told the agents that they had been stopped in their tracks by a mysterious Border Patrol officer who had ordered them to sit down and put their hands on their heads before vanishing in front of their eyes. The agents had stumbled across the group by chance and were bewildered to find them all silently seated in a circle on the ground, refusing to lower their hands, which were affixed firmly atop their heads. Eventually, they had managed to coax the migrants to follow them to the centre, and now joked that it was unlikely they would ever experience such good fortune again. 10 nights later, 2 border agents were alerted to a loud disturbance not far from where they were patrolling. Hurrying down the trail, they found a group of 30 distressed migrants, desperately trying to hand themselves over to the 2 Americans. They told their captors that they had been detained by a dead agent. They dubbed this apparition El Fantasma. Such sightings continued over the next few months, with groups of migrants either surrendering to the agents or being located sitting patiently waiting to be detained. They all named the lone figure who had stopped them as Agent Santiago, with many describing him as being translucent and illuminated by a soft and unearthly glow. 2 officers lying in wait for a group were amazed when a pair of migrants walked straight up to their hiding place and asked to be detained. As they headed back to the detention center, the prisoners explained that they had become separated from their group and that the ghostly agent had saved their lives. Luis Santiago had apparently directed the 2 Mexicans towards the hiding agents and had advised them that if they did not surrender, they would likely die of thirst. Along with the sightings, rumors began to circulate. Many of the migrants detained by the border force were released and later detained on further occasions when they again tried to enter the country. Some disclosed to Elmore and his fellow agents that Santiago had been deliberately lured to the edge of the dam by a handler, who had then persuaded his customers to push the agent over the edge. The incident seemed to have a marked effect on the criminal gangs who were operating in the area. Gradually, they began to avoid the White Cross Trail, instead favouring the more dangerous route via the Otay Lakes Dam. Reported encounters with the ghost of Agent Santiago seemed to be pushing the gangs closer and closer to the place of his demise, culminating in one final and tragic incident. In the early hours of the 21st of January 1996, a team of Border Patrol agents detected 15 illegal immigrants attempting to cross the dam. On being sighted, this group turned and ran, leading to a short pursuit on foot. During the course of the incident, 6 of the targets fell from the dam, with 1 sustaining fatal injuries. An investigation into this death was quickly initiated, with the surviving migrants questioned about what had occurred. The survivors all claimed that they had been detained by a lone border agent, who had drawn his weapon and opened fire. In the panic that followed, the group had been gripped by a herd mentality, running as one until the lead runner had fallen over the dam. As a result of their testimony, the first agent to arrive on the scene was interviewed on suspicion of misconduct. Agent Arlo maintained that the migrants had already been running before he took up the chase, and was adamant that he had not drawn his firearm. When forensic evidence confirmed his account, the migrants were then shown photographs of all the attending officers, in a bid to identify the agent in question. They were unable to do so, until one of the interviewers produced an old photo of Agent Santiago, who was subsequently picked out by all of the survivors. It soon became apparent that the person who had died was the handler of the group. Something had scared him sufficiently to take off, and his charges had immediately followed. In the confusion, he had blundered over the side of the dam, falling and sustaining injuries that were then made worse by the 5 migrants who had landed on top of him. In the aftermath of this incident, the sightings of the ghostly agent abruptly ceased. To the men and women who had served with Luis Santiago, it was clear what had taken place. Following his death, their colleague had made it his business to hunt down the criminal responsible for his murder. Finally, after 9 months, he had been successful, ending the life of his killer in the same manner he himself had died. Now, his soul at peace, Agent Santiago could at last draw a close to his final patrol. The tragic story of the Phantom Agent is by no means the only supernatural sighting reported by the agents who patrol the Otay Mesa. There have also been numerous sightings of a ghostly mother and daughter who were murdered there many years before. Officers working alone in the Copper Canyon area have often reported terrifying encounters with these two apparitions. One evening, Rocky Elmore had been deployed to the canyon to keep an eye on a party of trainees who were passing through the area on a night hike. It soon became clear that this group had become detached before an agent began screaming into his radio for help. Elmore immediately made his way down into the canyon to help search for the missing man. When the terrified trainee was located, he told his rescuers he had been walking alone when he had heard the sound of a woman crying. He had eventually located a lone figure crouching down by a nearby bush, crying out that she had been separated from her daughter. When he had approached her, she had looked up, and the front of her head had been completely devoid of any facial features. Another agent lying in wait for a group of migrants had heard approaching footsteps, but when he emerged from his position, he saw a lone woman in a nightdress walking towards him. As she stepped forward into a patch of moonlight, he had suddenly realized that she had no face, just a black mass where it should have been. Just as prevalent are sightings of a young girl walking alone through the border region in a white nightgown. Sometimes she will appear unexpectedly in front of an agent to tell them she is lost, and then disappear. At other times, officers will attempt to apprehend her as they believe she has become separated from another group. She then abruptly vanishes as they approach. The most disturbing story involving the girl in white centers around an agent who had parked up at the gates that prevented public access into the Marin Valley. As he had been unlocking the gates, he had caught sight of something floating in the nearby creek. Abandoning his task, he had walked down to the water and shone his torch towards this object, suddenly realizing it was the body of a young girl, floating face down. The agent had immediately turned and run back to the truck, where he had left his radio. Reaching inside and retrieving the device, he had turned to find the girl standing right next to him staring up. He was consumed by an overpowering sense of sadness before the child had disappeared, leaving him standing, alone and traumatized, next to his vehicle. One theory about these two apparitions centers on an abandoned ranch house, located at the most southern point of the Marin Valley. This ruined building has stood empty since the occupants were murdered by Native Americans during the 1800s, and it is rumoured that the family who lived there had been killed and thrown down the property's stone well. Rocky Elmore was one of many agents to have encountered something unearthly at the site. Attending the location following a report of lights having been seen there one evening, he and his partner had been about to give up the search when they realised that something was illuminating the inside of the ranch house. The two agents had watched on in confusion as a floating light had suddenly emerged from inside, straight through a solid stone wall. It was then joined by a number of identical lights, all of which had no obvious source. These lights cast no shadow and had begun to move around at high speed, seeming to chase and collide with one another. When the pair had tried to get closer to investigate, they had immediately disappeared. There have been other reports of mysterious activity within the vicinity. Stories of a large invisible entity which moves around in the dead of night, disturbing the foliage and water it passes through, but never revealing itself to the naked eye. Some agents also claim to have caught sight of large cat-like creatures stalking groups of migrants in the distance, and there are many reports of Sasquatch being seen in the area. It seems that there is something inexplicable that dwells within the mesa. Commentators have long drawn parallels between poltergeist activity and high concentrations of limestone and granite. The Otay Mesa has an abundance of both materials, and is often shrouded in mist and fog as a result of the moisture which is trapped and stored within them. Whilst it is easy for those who have not served in the Border Patrol to dismiss such testimony as paranoia or fatigue, it is notable that many of the stories coming from within their ranks are not widely circulated. The agents who come forward have not done so for notoriety or fame, but often in order to reassure colleagues who have experienced similar matters. There is clearly something within this region of the US border that has a deep and profound effect on those enlisted to police it. Something that captures the spirits of those who have died within the locality, giving them the opportunity to remain at the scene of their passing and correct whatever wrongs may have led to their demise. Our hearts go out to the family of Luis Santiago, along with all those who have lost their lives in this region. May their souls rest in eternal peace. Story 2: Tales from Stardust Ranch. We have already examined the inexplicable and haunting occurrences at Utah's infamous Skinwalker Ranch in previous episodes, but across the border, in neighbouring Arizona, lies another remote farmstead with an equally terrifying history. This week, we investigate one man's horrifying conflict with extraterrestrial intruders, as we pay a visit to Stardust Ranch. It had not been until early evening that John Edmonds had finally decided he'd had enough of hauling furniture and unpacking boxes, and was ready to call it a day. Stopping off at the kitchen in order to grab himself a hard-earned beer, he made his way out onto the porch and sat quietly surveying his new home. The ranch that he and his wife Joyce had just purchased covered 10 acres of land, and in addition to the 5-bedroom building itself, it came with a pool, a guest house, and 2 horse corrals. From an early age, John had dreamed of owning a place where he could spend his days tending to injured and unwanted horses, and he had finally made this a reality. Sipping his beer, Edmonds noticed some movement in the undergrowth that lined the property's far perimeter. After a few moments, a solitary figure emerged from the tree line, striding with purpose across the open fields towards the house. John had not been expecting anyone, and when the fading sunlight suddenly glinted off something long and metallic held in the approaching figure's hand, he instinctively stepped back inside to grab his revolver. Re-emerging from the farmhouse, Edmonds began to walk towards the intruder, openly displaying the firearm in a show of warning. As the distance between them closed, he found himself thinking that this must be something to do with the debacle surrounding the belongings of the previous owners. Several days prior, when he and Joyce had arrived at the ranch, they had found to their dismay that the premises were still filled with furniture and personal possessions. A phone call was made to the agents, who apologised profusely and asked them to come back the following day once they had spoken to the previous tenants. The next morning, John had returned to find the house empty, but every fixture and fitting was now mysteriously broken up and deposited outside in the empty swimming pool. Another call was made to the agents, who denied all knowledge of this, stating they had still not heard back from the previous owners. After another day of waiting, Edmonds had finally lost his patience with the situation and arranged to have the unwanted mess disposed of himself. As the 2 men pulled up a few feet short of one another, an uneasy silence descended on the scene. The stranger was dressed in the well-worn fatigues of an army veteran, with unkempt hair and a distinctly haunted expression, but it was the rusted machete he was brandishing that held John's attention, and caused him to keep his hand firmly on his gun. When the man spoke, his words were hushed, and he claimed to have worked for the previous owners. Edmonds calmly explained that the property had now changed hands, and asked the former employee why he was carrying the blade. the stranger replied that it was for hunting monsters, which is what he had been paid to do. John thought for a moment, then calmly told the man that his help was no longer required, as he had not seen any monsters recently. There was another brief pause before a mocking peal of laughter burst from the rancher's lips. The man petulantly threw the machete to the ground and began to walk away, before turning and shouting that John would be sorry. As he watched the retreating figure disappear back into the trees, the new owner of Stardust Ranch had no idea just how true this statement would be. Initially, the idyllic rural existence they had chosen worked well for John and Joyce. Over the first few weeks, they started to receive a steady supply of sick and neglected horses. Being only an hour and a half's drive from Phoenix meant that everything they needed was within easy reach. The first sign that the agents might not have been entirely honest about how they had marketed the property came when John tried to get the ranch's faulty phone line repaired. Despite having arranged 3 different appointments, nobody from the phone company had ever materialized to fix the problem. It was not until he registered a formal complaint that an engineer had reluctantly made a brief appearance. When he did eventually arrive, the repairman worked as fast as he could to rectify the problem, to the point where John demanded to know why he was so eager to leave. Without pausing to stop what he was doing, the worker hurriedly explained that the ranch was cursed, and that everybody in the local community went out of their way to avoid it. Several days after this unsettling conversation, it became clear to John that not everybody was choosing to avoid his property. On his morning rounds, he noticed that somebody had been tampering with the fencing that surrounded the 2 horse corrals. At several points, the metal fence posts had been wrenched out of the ground, and in some cases, they had been bent and twisted out of shape. The incidents continued, with the damage becoming progressively worse. John would hear strange humming noises at night, but when he went outside to look, he could not find their source. Only with the arrival of daylight the following morning would the full extent of the damage be discovered. Things eventually came to a climax when he found one of the horses dead. The unfortunate animal had been choked to death by a heavy iron post, which had somehow been warped and twisted around its neck. It was only as John puzzled over what could have bent the thick metal bar in such a way that Joyce broke down and told him that she felt like there were people in the farmhouse watching her. She said that she had caught sight of shadowy figures following her from room to room, silhouettes that only appeared at the periphery of her vision and seemed to dissolve or vanish when she tried to focus on them. Edmonds tried to reassure her that she was just tired and on edge because of the vandalism, but the senseless death of the horse concerned him. He decided to start placing weapons within easy reach at strategic points around the house. A deceptive period of calm then followed, but it was not long before the situation took a terrifying turn for the worse. One evening, John was awake in bed, unable to settle due to Joyce's periodic snoring. Whilst he lay staring at the room's far wall, the shadows there suddenly seemed to swell and contort, before a trio of dark figures materialized. Frozen in terror, he watched helplessly as the shadowy intruders slowly made their way over to his wife's side of the bed. As the lead figure reached out towards her, John felt his fear suddenly turn to rage. With a roar of anger, he leapt to his feet, reaching down for the aluminium baseball bat beside the bed. In seconds, he was across the room, lashing out at the dark shapes that were now leaning over his sleeping wife. With a wild swing, he felt the metal bat connect with the nearest one. There was a high-pitched shriek before the figures immediately vanished, leaving a bewildered Joyce asking John why he was stood looming over her with a baseball bat. The police were called, but they could find no evidence to back up John's claim. They seemed more concerned with the array of weapons that had been stashed in each room, and their departure only seemed to embolden whoever or whatever had invaded their home. On a weekly basis from this point onwards, John Edmonds would find himself fighting for both his and his wife's very survival. During the evenings, whilst he struggled to stay awake watching over Joyce, Edmonds began to hear deep humming sounds off in the distance. Occasionally, when he looked out of his window, he would observe what appeared to be gaping portals of some kind, inexplicably appearing in the middle of the night sky, illuminating the surrounding darkness. John witnessed mysterious craft and bright orbs of light disappearing into the portals, which would then close behind them, leaving no trace of their existence. Sometimes these objects would be shadowed or pursued by what looked like military aircraft, fueling his suspicions that the government were fully aware of what was happening on the ranch. The nighttime incursions by the occupants of these craft continued. John observed that they always moved around in groups of 3, seemingly possessing the ability to pass through locked windows and doors. He described them as being approximately 4 feet tall, with skin that was deathly cold to the touch. On the occasions where he was able to get close enough to strike out at them with a knife or other bladed instrument, Edmonds stated that the fluid which issued forth from their wounds had a similar consistency to brake fluid. One evening, Edmonds saw the family Rottweiler pursuing a group of these creatures across the ground outside the house. It was able to catch and bite one of them, which subsequently disappeared into thin air. Tragically, the dog immediately began to choke, dying a short time afterwards. The rancher would lose a further 2 dogs in identical circumstances, but these were not the only animals that would suffer. Some of the horses would also be found mutilated. At other times, he would see the hulking shadows of what he called Barillo men, stalking the extremities of his property. He stated that these creatures resembled Sasquatches. Despite his best efforts, Edmonds could not possibly remain awake all the time, and he would often collapse out of sheer exhaustion. One evening, he had involuntarily dozed off, but was suddenly jolted awake with a feeling of pure dread. What he witnessed chilled him to his very core. Joyce was fast asleep in front of him, but was being lifted off the bed by a thin beam of bright light, being projected into the room from outside. As Joyce's sleeping form was propelled across the room towards the now open window, he knew he had to act fast. Up until this point, he had tried to avoid using his rifle if possible, due to the fact his house was a brick building and for fear of his neighbours reporting him to the police, but now he had no choice. In a heartbeat, John was outside, his assault rifle in hand. Without even looking to see what was emitting the beam of light, he aimed in the direction and fired off an entire magazine of ammunition, the weapon kicking wildly against his shoulder. He heard the rounds impacting off something metallic a short distance away, but the light beam continued to shine. Within moments he'd reloaded, and again fired blindly at the light source, until it blinked out of existence. In the sudden silence, he saw an undefined dark shape moving away from the house at great speed, before it disappeared into a portal. Returning to the bedroom, he found his wife collapsed in a corner. By now, John was beside himself and resorted to handcuffing Joyce to the bed in order to prevent her from being taken. Despite his best efforts, both he and his wife began to experience periods of missing time. Sometimes, when they awoke, they would find strange and inexplicable injuries on their bodies. The most worrying of these resembled deep cuts or lacerations, which had healed as if some lengthy period of time had passed since they were inflicted. Finally, an exasperated Edmonds contacted the local media, pleading for assistance from anybody who could help rid him of the attackers. He participated in radio and television interviews, allowing ufologists and research teams to visit the ranch. However, the problems persisted. Eventually, after 20 years desperately trying to follow his dream, John was forced to give in. In 2016, he and Joyce sold Stardust Ranch and moved away, never to return. At first glance, the story of John and Joyce Edmonds is as easy to dismiss as many other tales of its kind. A scenario where supposed intelligent alien life has elected to harass and torment an unremarkable couple over a 20-year time frame seems an unlikely one. The apparent inability to capture their assailants on film at any point during those 2 decades also seems somewhat unconvincing. John Edmonds himself said that he had killed 18 of the creatures that invaded his home, but never presented any of the bodies. He did explain that they disappeared immediately after death, which many skeptics believe is highly convenient. Many commentators who have examined the incident are also quick to point out that prior to going public with his story, John Edmonds had been looking to sell the ranch for $1 million. In the aftermath of the resultant media circus, the property would end up being sold for more than 5 times that price. So rather than a terrifying and shocking case of alien harassment, could this in fact be one of the most successful marketing ploys in the history of real estate? Ultimately, that could be the case, but there remains a significant number of incidents that add weight to the story, and this is in no small part due to the fact that John and Joyce are not the only people to report strange activity on the property, with the number of alleged witnesses being much higher. Gina Ryans and her family lived at the ranch during the 1970s, and since John Edmonds went public, she also came forward to speak to the media about her past experiences. She describes ghostly figures that would unexpectedly invade the home, with her and her younger brother feeling temperatures plunge dramatically whenever the entities passed from room to room. In 2015, the Ghost Adventures team spent several days at the ranch whilst filming an episode of their show. During the visit, a number of mysterious lights and strange figures were observed moving around the property, with one of the team members sustaining unexplained bruises to one of her arms. They left the ranch believing that the intruders were not extraterrestrial in nature, but were instead demonic entities masquerading as aliens. They arrived at this conclusion because the creatures seemed to retreat whenever prayers or biblical texts were recited by the victims. They also went on to state that there was a spirit of a man haunting the property, who shot himself in the living room. On another occasion, a different research team reported having disturbed a thin humanoid figure that ran off and disappeared into the undergrowth. When the investigators searched the area, they discovered a circular stone, into which a mysterious star shape had somehow been carved. The most intriguing and well-publicised evidence to come out of Stardust Ranch occurred during a live web chat between John and the Camelot Project's Kerry Cassidy in 2016. It was only when Cassidy was reviewing the footage of the interview that she noticed what appeared to be a short grey figure momentarily peeking out from behind a wall. This went unnoticed by Edmonds, who had been sitting with his back towards it. In 2013, a mutual friend put John in contact with a biologist by the name of William Levengood. After some initial consultation between the two men, Edmonds was able to send Levengood samples of tissue and fluid that had been left behind after he had struck one of the intruders with a short sword. A few days later, Levengood contacted him in an excited state. The DNA he'd extracted from the tissue was unlike anything else on Earth. Alongside this, the fluid that John had provided was completely saturated with a substance resembling chlorophyll, and was very similar to samples that had been collected at the scene of cattle mutilations all around the globe. Levengood asked John if he was prepared to go public with the findings, and then disclosed that he himself intended to reach out to the rest of the scientific community. After this call, things went unexpectedly quiet, and it would not be until several weeks later, when he tried to regain contact with Levengood, that Edmonds was informed the scientist had died. With growing apprehension, John inquired what had happened to his samples, only to be informed that there had been a fire at the laboratory a few days after Levengood's death, and that nothing had been salvaged. He would later discover that Levengood's wife had also died, not long after her husband. This is perhaps not as strange as it sounds, as both the biologist and his wife were in their 80s. Nevertheless, Levengood's death would further raise John's suspicions about the government somehow being involved, but it was an unexpected visit not long after he had contacted the media, which finally convinced him that the authorities were working against him. About 2 weeks after he had spoken to the press, John was working in one of the corrals, when he saw 2 men dressed in black suits standing outside the main gates. As he watched in disbelief, the 2 figures seemed to walk straight through the metal bars, before approaching him and ordering him to keep quiet about the activity on his property. The 2 men, who wore dark hats and sunglasses and emitted a foul odour, then walked away before disappearing completely. Whether or not you believe John Edmonds, there does appear to be a degree of honesty in his retelling of events. He has been accused of exaggerating his accounts, but has remained steadfast in his conviction. People who have interviewed him in relation to his claims state that he is a sober and convincing witness. His stories, whilst fantastic in nature, are always told in a grounded and logical manner, with the traumatic effects they have left upon his soul clear in the way that he relates them. It's possible that he may have exaggerated his accounts, but we can't help but feel there is perhaps more to this story. Whilst others have advocated the fact that he has profited from this misery as a reason to doubt him, why not turn a bad situation to one's advantage if the opportunity so arises? It doesn't do his integrity any favours, but it doesn't mean that there is no truth to his story either. It's interesting to note just how much the ranch would eventually sell for, more than 5 times the asking price, which is unheard of for properties in that area. Assuming the buyer purchased the property because of its supernatural activity, this seems like a huge investment to make based on witness testimony alone. One has to wonder whether the new owner has witnessed the activity for themselves. In any case, the descriptions of events bear a striking similarity to the incidents which took place at the more famous Skinwalker Ranch. Alongside this, Arizona itself remains a hotbed for some of the most infamous UFO incidents reported on American soil. Stardust Ranch lies only a stone's throw from where people have historically gathered to observe the famed Phoenix Lights. It is also close to the town of Snowflake, where Travis Walton was allegedly abducted back in 1975. In future episodes, we intend to return to the Copper State to cover these and other associated stories. Whatever the case may be, there does appear to be a degree of correlation between this story and those of other reported incidents, although we concede that it is difficult to believe due to the lack of any supporting evidence. If there is any truth to the tales surrounding Stardust Ranch, we can only hope that John and Joyce have finally found the peace which they so desperately fought for.